Доброго вечора, чи доброго після обіднього часу. Раді вітати вас в стінах Українського католицького університету. І я зараз прийду на англійську, так як ми транслюємо лекцію англійською мовою. Good afternoon, esteemed guests, colleagues, professors and students at the Sheptytsky Center of Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine. A warm welcome to our online audience joining us from around the globe. Today we are privileged to have with us a distinguished speaker, Professor Dave Snowden, who will be presenting on the theme of entangling universities with society, new paths to innovations. Professor Snowden is a leading authority in the field of complexity science and decision-making. He is renowned for creating the Kinevin framework and developing the SenseMaker research tool, both of which have revolutionized how we understand and navigate complex environments. He's also the co-author of a field guide for decision makers managing complexity and chaos in times of crisis, a significant contribution that was developed in partnership with the European Commission's Joint Research Center and the Kinevin Center. Currently, Professor Snowden is dedicated to advancing research and catalyzing innovation across various industries and governments. His work draws on knowledge of anthropology, neuroscience, and complex adaptive systems theory, addressing some of the most challenging issues in strategy and organizational decision-making. In addition to his impressive portfolio, Professor Snowden is an extraordinary visiting professor at various esteemed institutions and has authored award-winning research on leadership, receiving the Academy of Management Award for Best Practitioner Paper. His experience includes a notable tenure as an IBM director, where he was recognized as one of IBM's 6 on-demand thinkers. Now, let us extend a warm welcome to Professor Dave Snowden as he takes the stage.
Thank you for that. I'll try and live up to it. Just to say up front, I have absolutely no objection to being interrupted or having arguments. I know nobody will, but one of these days, somebody will interrupt. So feel free if you need it. But the plan is to leave time for questions at the end of it. I should also say that my background is not in educational theory. No, that's not where I come from. My undergraduate degree is a joint honours between physics and philosophy, which was an indulgence when I did it, but has proved more useful since. But you will see both of those disciplines come out in what I'm going to talk about today. And subsequently to that, I've probably been one of the pioneers in anthropology in developing distributed ethnography. And that I'm going to talk about in terms of the role of young people in mediating and understanding what's actually going on the ground in society, i.e. what we call the street stories. You know, the stories of the school gate, the stories of the drink after work, the points where meaning really emerges in society. So that's kind of like part of the background. I was actually, having worked on that, so I did my degree. I then worked in the World Council of Churches for 4 years. I think I was the first Catholic to ever do that, which was an interesting experience. And worked on the program to combat racism. So I worked on things like indigenous land rights, the worker priest movement back in Rio de Janeiro and places like that. So that was a really formative experience. And to do that in your early 20s, you get experiences that you probably want to forget. I still remember an indigenous activist being shot in front of me. I can still remember the blood. By a mine worker and being told by the police he was only an abo and therefore they wouldn't do anything. We sort of forget just how immediate some of this is to the modern day. You know, we've had a period of comparative peace. You guys fell out of it earlier than other nations, but we're never far from that sort of aspect. As I explained to my children years ago, Catholics didn't have the vote in Northern Ireland when I was growing up. And that's something people forget. So there's a lot which goes on in society, and part of what I'm going to argue for is we need more exposure to that. Just to give you an illustration, we do a lot of work with the government of Singapore. There is a general argument here that the future is cities and small countries because they're cohesive, whereas nation states are becoming more and more difficult. And Singapore is a good example of this. But they have an elitist educational system. And one of the projects we did identified that they had a real problem with people who were under the age of 40. And when you look at that and you know the history of Singapore, is the people who were in the civil service when they were expelled from Malaysia, when Singapore was almost a basket case, yet know that things can be really bad. And they pulled Singapore through that to the point where it's now one of the richest nations in the world. It has free at the point of entry healthcare. It has a meritocratic educational system. It has the highest rate of interracial marriage of any society in the world, which is a good indicator if you look at it, and a state housing policy which could do with being copied elsewhere. So it's a very successful society. The trouble is the younger civil servants had not lived through the messy bit. They'd only ever lived when everything was neat and tidy. And what we actually found when we were looking at their resilience, that it was actually very low. And so to give you an example of the program we then did, is we took what are called the President Scholars. These are the elite of an Asian elite educational system. If you've ever seen an Asian educational system and you've met the Tiger Mothers, you know just how elite it is. And what we ended up doing is putting them into development projects in impoverished communities for 2 years before they went on to do their higher education. Because we wanted to expose them to the fact that things could go wrong before they started to think about education in general. And certainly when my daughter went to university to do anthropology, I made sure she could spend a year in Australia working with Indigenous people before she went there. So she had some practical experience in that movement between school and university. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. It's how do we actually bring academic discipline into practical work and understanding. And it requires that sort of experience. It also comes from my own background. I'm the child of 2 parents who were first generation university students. My mother was born in a slum in Cardiff Docks in a room with 20 people. And she won her way out of that with an educational scholarship to go to school and then an education scholarship to study German. And she decided if she was going to study German, she might as well do it in Germany. So she went to university in Hanover in 1947, which was pretty brave of her. She used to tell me how she had to wear a passport around her neck so she wouldn't get raped by British soldiers, which kind of like tells you something. Yeah? And if you don't know it, Welsh culture is very strongly pro-education. Education is the way you don't have to go down the mines, is kind of like a summary. So we weren't allowed not to be educated. I had to read the whole of the Bible by the time I was 11. My mother was a good atheist, but she said I wouldn't understand European literature if I didn't know my Bible. The punishment was I then became a Catholic, but that's another matter, right? You have to rebel at some stage in your lives, all right? And in the whole of Shakespeare by we were 14, the assumption was you have to be educated. And there was actually an argument between my wife and my mother. It's always dangerous when that happens. Because my wife was going to reward the children if they passed their exams. And my mother said, you should reward them if they don't pass their exams, because they're going to need the money. And if they're not motivated to pass the exams, they shouldn't do it anyway. And I still have sympathy with that point of view, but I stayed neutral in that argument. It sort of made more sense. Yeah? And I'm trying to make a point here. Education was, certainly in the UK, was a major source of social mobility. And that remains one of its functions. And I want to come back to that later, right? Because these days it's less about social mobility and often now about cultural mobility and cultural integration. And that's something we're working on in the States and Germany at the moment that, again, I want to talk about. So I've meandered around this a bit, but engagement with society is a key thing. If we look at other issues or problems, we've seen a homogenization of education. So I was at a conference on nuclear war and one of those depressing things you get invited to, right? In an Oxford college, run by the Lord Allardyce, and we were taken around the college. Now, the interesting thing about Oxford colleges and Cambridge colleges is academics lived in them. That's the whole point about the hall. Yeah, they had a basic room, they had accommodation, they had food, and they had a really good wine cellar. Yeah, but they didn't earn very much money. It was kind of like monastic. The assumption was they were so passionate about their subject that they wanted to devote their life to that. And the role of college and society was to give them the freedom to do that. Okay? Now, we've lost some of that in homogenization. Right? So governments are now looking at education and saying, well, how many of your graduates are employed within 1 year of them leaving university? And is the knowledge they've acquired producing commercial benefit within 2 to 3 years? Now, if you actually look at this, and it's been studied in the UK, most of the economic growth in the UK in the 60s and 70s arose from theoretical research, which nobody could see any purpose for in the 30s and 40s. And that's kind of like worth remembering, right? So there needs to be some space in education for something which is just purely research, purely speculative, and that applies in the arts as well as it applies within the sciences, right? And we've kind of like lost a bit of that. I don't know about the Ukraine, but in the UK, we used to have universities, and we had polytechnics, and we had technical colleges. And so the universities were 5% of the population. It was fully funded. I came out of university having saved some money, and we had enough money to get drunk most weeks, right? No, of course we didn't, you understand, but if we had wanted to, we could have, right? My children came out with huge debts, but only 5% of the population went to university. Yeah? And that was kind of like a different world. Right? A lot went to polytechnics or technical colleges or into apprentice schemes which mixed academic education with practice. And that had a different financial model around it. What we then did, and I think this is a general mistake, I'll explain the theory behind this in a minute, is we homogenized education. Everything became a university. Yeah. So instead of having heterogeneous systems, we had homogeneous systems. And the problem with homogeneous systems is there isn't enough variety, so there's no innovation, there's no stimulus, there's no what the biologists call gradient within the system. Yeah, so I want to raise that now because that's going to be a growing issue going downstream. The danger is if we focus entirely on technical education, we're going to lose that abstract idea. And by the way, there are other problems here. I'm going to start to throw some science in. If you don't know it, art and music come before language in human evolution. This is actually quite significant. Primitive drums, cave paintings. That then develops to the height of modern opera, symphonic music, Caravaggio in painting. You can think of lots of examples. We think the evolutionary reason for that, and there has to be an evolutionary reason, is that abstraction, i.e. art, allows you to see novel connections between things. So moving to an abstract level means you're moved from reality for a period, and so you suddenly start to see connections between things that you wouldn't see if you were to use a phrase down and dirty. So we now think that's one of the reasons for the growth of art as part of human evolution. I've had some of my best ideas looking at Caravaggio's Seven Mercies. I created a whole framework from that because I saw the way he used art to create liminality, and I suddenly realized we'd missed liminality in the core model, so I put it in. So my best ideas come at the opera. Right? And most people will tell you this. It's no coincidence that a lot of theoretical physicists are also really good musicians. Yeah, the two sort of go together. Now, the problem then with the focus on STEM education is that you actually remove a key part of the educational experience, which is linked to innovation. Yeah, art is critical for innovation in human systems. You focus entirely on STEM, you've got a problem. And we got this in Australia, to a lesser extent the UK, in that if you go to university to do STEM, the government will pay all your university fees. But if you want to go to university to do the humanities, you've got to pay for them yourself. So actually, to study how to govern is now becoming the privilege of people with rich parents. But to have a free education, you just effectively have to become a technologist or an engineer, which means you can be instantly employable. Now, that's almost a 19th century model of society in which the rich are educated to govern and everybody else just has to be a slave laborer in that sense. And that's a growing problem in education. Right? So I'm going to come back to this when I talk about transdisciplinary work later. Okay, so I've given you one base science fact. The research group I run, and have run now for 20 years and 7 years before that in IBM, our approach is to start with natural science, and see what natural science says about a subject, and develop methods and tools consistent with that, and then experiment with them for a period of time to get them right. You'll see my physics background coming through here. What happens with physics is you start in theoretical physics, and one day the mathematics just looks beautiful. It's one of the ways you know something is right in physics. If it looks beautiful, it's probably right, right? Then you get a bit bored with it, so you hand it over to the experimental physicists, who are the ones whose maths wasn't good enough to be theoretical physicists, but that's an old prejudice. And they spend several years working it through, experimenting and developing it, testing it. You may or may not be proved right. And when they get bored, they hand it over to the engineers for mass execution. Yeah, sorry, you're going to get a flavor of the style at the moment. We did the same sort of thing. So we've just produced a whole new method to map the affordance landscape of where you are as an organization. What is afforded to you by the environment in which you sit, and what can you actually change and what you can't change. Now, that was published last year. It's taken off as a method. It's now been used extensively in military environments. I was talking with some of your military staff about it on Sunday, in terms of what's the energy gradient from our perspective, what's the energy gradient from the enemy. Right? So that's it's gone into engineering phase. I spent about, I think, 8 years on that before I even put it in front of a client, and 3 years of experimenting with clients before I moved it into that phase. So that's kind of like our approach. And the reason we're doing that is that natural science is subject to repeatable experiments and peer review. If you don't know it, and sorry for any psychologists in the room, there's a major crisis in psychology at the moment. It's called the crisis of repetition, because people are repeating the classical experiments and getting different results. Yeah, and that's not surprising, because the restriction of variables to achieve the results doesn't represent reality, and so you can see where that's coming. Now, I'll say now, I mean, we do a lot in social science, but from my point of view, social science and the humanities, their power is their power to explain things, not their power to predict things. One of the things natural science can do is it can produce prediction, because other people can repeat the same experiments. Right? So we decided we work with that rather than an empirical approach. Now, the other reason we rejected empiricism, and I'm going to throw some science in again, if you give radiologists, I don't know what radiologists have done to offend the cognitive neuroscience community, but they've obviously done something really bad, because all the experiments are run on them. So you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, you ask them to look for anomalies. On the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% on average of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. It's called inattentional blindness. We do not see what we do not expect to see. And the only human beings who are exempt from that are not social science researchers or consultants. They're people who are fully autistic. i.e. they're scanning everything and they're seeing everything, so they can't operate in the world. Now, one of the reasons for that is the way we make decisions. Yeah, this is Andy Clark and other people's work. We're constantly what's called micro-hallucinating. Just to be clear, human beings hallucinate, AI bullshits. Yeah, it's just giving you a probabilistic forecast of what it thinks you might want to believe. Hallucination in humans has evolved in very sophisticated ways. The source of the hallucinations are your own memories. Now, just to be clear, you never remember anything accurately anyway. As Freeman proved, there are chemicals which break up the neuroreceptors on the brain, so you can't remember anything quite the same way twice. Which is why we generally we don't do after-action reviews. We do capture of knowledge in the field under fire. The closer you get to people's actual experience, the more accurate the data. We also use other people's stories. People talk about Homo narans as much as we talk about Homo sapiens. We're storytelling apes. Stories are one of the most effective mechanisms of communication we have, and we do it all the time, everywhere. And by the way, we generally tell negative stories. Has anybody told stories to children? Do you tell them bedtime stories in which, you know, Janet and John stay at home, do what mummy and daddy says, you know, achieve the family mission statement and meet the targets we set for them in return for their allowances? And anybody tell those sort of stories? No, we tell stories of doom, disaster, wolves, witches, God knows what else. We scare the living daylights out of them. And and unless you're the Brothers Grimm, you have a happy ending so they can go to sleep at night, all right? But, you know, Slavic fairy stories don't even seem to have happy endings, because the goal is to share failure, not success. Human beings pay more attention to failure than they do to success, because in evolutionary terms, avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy than imitation of success. So to put it bluntly, we evolved as malicious gossips because it has survival capability. What stories spread around water coolers? Negative stories. What stories do the press pick up? Yeah. So it's the negative stories have a more profound impact on us than the positive ones. There's some consultants who don't like it when you say that, but you know, I think the evangelical tendency from the United States has had a bad effect on some consultants, and they want everybody to have happy, clappy meetings, all right? But that's me being prejudiced. So, and then the third source is pure imagination. I get a lot of my ideas from reading science fiction. Yeah, it's one of the roles of fiction. You know, we have an ability to imagine things which we couldn't experience. And what happens is all of those micro hallucinations, this is happening in nanoseconds, right, are entangling themselves with multiple sensory data, oral, visual, but also smell. It turns out pheromones are trust determination, which is a problem with virtual education and virtual teaching. Peripheral vision is really important for humans, but you can't have peripheral vision within a virtual environment. And we know there's things about resonance, you know, which we don't yet fully understand. So, for example, if a mother sleeps with a baby in a bed but without the husband, which is what would have happened in earlier society, the mother's heart goes into physical resonance with the baby's heart and can actually restart it. Now, we don't know how that happens yet. But the point is, human beings are taking into account sensory data that science does not yet fully understand. So that data is constantly entangling itself with the micro hallucinations. And the first pattern which comes together, we apply. Yeah, we satisfy, we don't optimize. We do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why this happens. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid lions? Now, by that time, the only document of any use to you will be the Book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of an escape manual from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a purported survivor. Yeah, we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan, privileging our most recent individual and collective experiences. Oh, and by the way, the most used scan of any available data is less than 5%. If you're Chinese, it doubles. Yeah, and one of the reasons for that, we think, is in order to speak Mandarin, you have to understand the context of every word. So Chinese students will focus on context, not object, whereas American students will focus on object, not context. And that has implications for military strategy and economic strategy and all sorts of other things as well. But you see where I'm going with this? Yeah, the sort of Enlightenment myth, which tends to dominate things, that if you just give people the right training and they have the right competencies and they have the right information, they will make the right decisions, is complete nonsense. It doesn't work that way. Yeah, with a limited amount of data stimulates us, that creates a series of hallucinations, and then we actually go with the first pattern which appears to fit. Now, there are major implications for this, by the way, if you think about not seeing the gorilla. If you go out and interview people as a social scientist, you form a subconscious hypothesis within the first 5 interviews, and you literally only hear things which match that hypothesis afterwards. Now, yes, you can record the interviews and transcribe them, but then you've lost tone of voice, you've lost all sorts of other sensory signals. Text is a very limited way of representing human knowledge. Another problem with AI. Text and tokens is just not enough. Now, I'm sort of throwing some of the stuff we base it on to make the point. Now, one of the consequences for that is the stories that people tell are critical. So I want to move that on now and talk a little bit about evaluation. I'm sort of moving around and about on this. I used to teach at the Kedge Business School. It wasn't a major school, but I quite liked it. Marseille is a nice place to teach, and I could do a walk on the Carnac walk at the weekend. And then my pupil score, I've always worried why students have to score lecturers. I just don't buy that, I'm afraid. It's not a consumer relationship. Either way, my score went down from 93 to 82. So I wasn't qualified to teach the next year. So yeah, that's okay. So I asked why. And it turned out it was the Chinese students. So I was doing this is a master's program. Whenever I teach a master's program, 20% of the mark goes for proving you've read something which I didn't teach. That seems to me a perfectly reasonable provision. You're on a master's program, you should be reading around the subject. I want to see, there's 20% of the marks available for proving in your paper that you went to sources that I didn't teach you. That was rejected by the Chinese students as Professor Snowden, he wants to examine us on things he hasn't taught us. Yeah. Now, as I say, I think that's problematic because teaching is starting to move into information provision and the ability to regurgitate that information. And of course, AI is better at that than human beings. Yeah, so there is an argument if AI actually does a better job than your teachers, the problem isn't that AI is good, the problem is that your teachers are really bad. Yeah, and the measurement system impacts on that. When I was at school, our headmaster also taught. Headmasters weren't full-time administrators, they taught. He taught English. He knew Shakespeare backwards. He never had a learning plan. He just walked into the class and he inspired people to learn, and everybody, including poor kids, got grade A's. He wouldn't survive in a modern environment because he wouldn't have a teaching plan. My daughter won the university prize for the best master's degree. I'm still quite proud of that. Yeah, sorry, I'm allowed to be proud father from time to time. The essence of the idea which won her that prize, which was a reworking of Deleuzian epistemology, which was quite sophisticated, was in her first year undergraduate essay. And I still remember her phoning me up and she said, I've failed and I've failed. She'd never failed anything in her life before. So I got her to send me the essay and it was original. And I said, but you haven't written to the marking plan, have you? You've got to realize that they've got a marking plan and you've got to write to that. So writing something original wasn't privileged. Now, I remember with our university, my first essay came back, sorry, this is a British philosophy department, linguistic based, with this is metaphysics, not philosophy, please rewrite it. So I sent it back with metaphysics is philosophy, please mark it. And we carried on like that for 3 years and we all thoroughly enjoyed it and I got good grades. Yeah? Now, the problem is by making everything explicit, you destroy knowledge creation. And coming back to that issue, information regurgitation over explicit measurements is deeply problematic. Yeah? I was at Hull University where I was visiting chair the other day. There was a big notice outside the lecture theatre and it said, annual student survey. We have an annual student survey in the UK. The better our score, the more valuable your degree. Never forgotten that. And I pointed out it was a business school. If they had to teach the kids that, they weren't doing a very good job anyway. But the measurement system isn't a measurement system, it's a targeting system. If you don't know anybody know Goodhart's law? Okay, British economist. Any statistical instrument used for policy will lose all value. That's translated by Marilyn Strathern, who's a really ferocious anthropologist. You do not want to cross Marilyn. Into every time a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure. Yeah? If you ask people to measure something explicitly, they work out what they should say, not what they need to say. Yeah. Also, evaluation creates stress. I'm going to come on to an alternative to that in a minute, which is one of the new research methods. If you tackle anything directly, you can't trust the results. Yeah, and if you look at the distribution, for example, on a Likert scale in any social science research project, the evidence is people gift an answer or they game an answer. Anybody filled out one of those net promoter score things at a hotel? Yeah, would you recommend our product to your friend? I mean, it's a good example. It used to be a measure, then it became a target. I never score hotel staff badly because their wages are based on it. Every time I hire a car, they tell me that the score they get will determine their wages, and would I please give them a good score? And as I say, if we score well on the student satisfaction survey, your university goes up the league table, so your degree is worth more. Yeah, this is kind of like a farcical process, right, in terms of the way it works. So let's take a different approach. I'm now going to start to introduce new research methods. So one of the things that we focused on was we knew that when people told stories, those stories revealed a huge amount of meaning or attitudes. Yeah, but it's not, and this, by the way, comes from working on counterterrorism for the US government for 10 years. I've just come back from Washington with some meeting with some very depressed Democrats. Other things are going on as we sit here. And as I said to them, you think you are marketing to Yale graduates because you believe what people say in focus groups and what they say to opinion polls, when what you're asking is explicit. And if you ask people explicit questions, you can't trust the results. And I said, the reality is the election was determined by sentiment. It was street stories, it was church stories, it was bar stories, it was sports club stories. Those are the things which created what Deleuze calls an assemblage, a pattern of narrative which meant that people voted for Trump. I'm not going to get into assemblage theory now, that's too much for this audience, all the time I've got rather. Now, so we decided what we needed to do, and this was weak signal detection in counterterrorism, is we needed to capture those street stories. If we could understand those street stories at scale, we could understand the underlying sentiment. The problem is, how do you interpret them? Because if I just capture them in text format, I'm going to be reliant on an algorithm, which is biased by its training data sets. And that's a major problem in AI, by the way, is all the training sets are based on a very specific North Atlantic culture, which doesn't necessarily work elsewhere. So it's biased by that. And if I do longitudinal research, if I transcribe it and get people to tag it, the time response time is going to be too long, because I need to get data in real time so I can give real-time feedback loops. And that was when one day in Washington, we had the bright idea of why don't we make people ethnographers to their own condition? So why don't we give people in the field the right to be ethnographers? And one of the most effective groups we found for that is university students and students at college. Yeah, if you don't know about brain plasticity, sorry, I'm going to depress some of you, but it'll be good news later. Between early 20s female, late 20s male, it's earlier for women because they were more productive in primitive society than men. And then sort of late 40s, mid 50s, both sexes, the brain locks down based on the prejudices of the society you belong to. You're very unlikely to depart from those prejudices because you've got to survive in that society. What happens as you get older, it's a chemical trigger. If you survived into your 50s in a hunter-gatherer community, you've obviously got something about you, but you can't lead the tribe anymore, so you have to retire and go into the wisdom business. That's something I've been working on for a decade or so now, right? Interestingly, for most of our evolutionary history, grandparents have been the primary teachers of children. And there's a thing I call the grandparent syndrome, in that grandparents will tell things to grandchildren they won't tell to children, and vice versa, because the power relationship is different. I am now a grandparent. My son has produced a granddaughter. She's 1.5 years old, named after a Welsh women rugby player, so we're getting that right. And I've told him I've already forgotten everything he did between the ages of 14 and 18, but I tend to remember it in vivid detail in about 12 years and pass it on to my granddaughter. Now, this is called grandparents' revenge, and it's fairly common. Yeah. So coming back to the point, right? Getting young people to act as ethnographers gives you really good data, better data than researchers. Very few people refuse a young person on a school project in terms of, and they don't feel threatened by the person. But critically, the person comes from that culture. We've done this with Roma communities in Hungary in using Roma children as ethnographers to Roma rather than researchers from a radically different culture. We've done it with young people in Malmo, refugees, to capture stories from refugees by people from their own background and their own community rather than people from outside. And then the big thing we did was to make that a quantitative approach, not a qualitative approach. Sorry, this is a physicist in me speaking. So we used to say in physics, and I sort of don't apologize for this, social scientists suffer from physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words. They never have enough data to form any valid conclusion, was the sort of joke. But from a physics point of view, I want lots and lots of data from lots of sources, because then the patterns I get from that are more likely to be true than the patterns from a limited number of sources or a limited set of interviews. So that's what we're trying to move towards. So we developed a method in which people use geometric shapes. So remember that sort of satisfaction survey? I'll give you the standard example. You might get asked this: does your manager consult you on a regular basis? Scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time. Familiar with that type of question? You know exactly what answer they want. All right, so you either gift it or you game it. And it's a context-free question in a context-specific world, which is a huge problem with a lot of research. Because certainly if you work at any modern company, you've got more than one manager, and sometimes they consult you and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they should and sometimes they shouldn't. So we take a very different approach. We say, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your workplace? Or what story would you tell your 17-year-old self about the university? That's actually really powerful. Then we ask people to index that story. So we give them 6 triangles. One of the triangles might say, in this story, the manager's behavior is altruistic, assertive, analytical. So we give them 3 positive qualities. Now, I've wired students up for this. One of the advantages of having a visiting chair in the psychology department is you can do whatever you want with the students because they've signed up for it. It is rather odd that all the psychology experiments are run on psychology students and people don't question that, but never mind, right? But I have wired students up. When they've got to give them 6 triangles, a different part of the brain engages with deciding where it is than if you give them Likert scales. It's called novelty receptive processing. What happens is the anomaly, the not knowing what answer is expected, makes people think more deeply. So with 6 triangles, I get 18 data points. Start to get the principle? Right, now that's a mixed methods research. It's called distributed ethnography. It's written up, it's documented. You can look at that. It's now got the peer-reviewed papers. What it allows us to do is to gather data at significant scale and respect what is called epistemic justice, which is the right to interpret your own experience, not have it interpreted by somebody else. And that gives me more authentic data. That also allows me to measure. So for example, in a South African university, where we got scholarship kids, so people who won a scholarship to come to university, because of that, we can quite easily get them to keep a daily diary. What have I learned? What am I going to learn? And we can allow them to actually answer interesting questions about stress or whatever. And we can look at, is the stress caused by teachers, by family, by position? We've got all sorts of ways of doing that. That allows me to have a real-time feedback loop at a university level about key students, because that data is coming in real time, and I can see how their attitudes and beliefs are changing, but I'm not asking direct questions, so I'm not putting anybody in a morally hazardous position. And that's one of the ways that you start to do measurement. We're now doing it, we've done it at Georgetown now, and that's quite depressing. I remember it was at Georgetown University. I said, that's great if we put that in place. The next time we have a campus shooting, we'll be able to get responses straight away. And it was the fact they said the next time we have a campus shooting, which rather depressed me, right? But that's using your own students as a sensor network and measuring how they feel by multiple micro observations on a continuous basis, which is quant. But the narrative also then explains what the quantitative means. What we're doing, and we've done now in 3 countries, is increasingly, and we're building this to a program, we want every 16-year-old in every school in the world to be an ethnographer into their communities every week. And we've proved we can do that on 4 continents. We now know how to do it. We know the cost of doing it. We're now preparing packs for city mayors and other people to pick that up and do it. And the goal is to have a way of representing citizen sentiment at scale in real time, rather than have focus groups and polling groups and everything else. It's also designed as a counter to social media, because you know that the origin of the data is valid. Yeah, there's no way you can determine in social media anymore what is true or what is false. It's extremely difficult. So instead of trying to work at the output, you get the input right. Now that for us is a really important project. We also think it's one of the things which is valuable for universities. So again, in a South African university, and I'm throwing ideas together, when people join the university, we put them in a group of 5 from different schools. So if I come in to do physics, I'll be put in a group, and actually it's a voluntary group. You choose who you want to work with, but you've got to choose people from different categories. We actually use speed dating and dating software, agency software for this, all right? You want people to choose who they want to work with, but choose within categories. So I would be in a group with somebody from engineering, somebody from the humanities. You get the principle? Yeah. So what we're doing is linking people across the silos and getting them to diarize their experience on a daily basis. That's fairly easy to incentivize. It's not difficult to reward. So that gives us a way of understanding student sentiment, yeah, which is quite important. It also starts to create informal networks between the different disciplines. I'm going to finish off with a formal method on that. So that has a multiple purpose. Yeah. It also allows us to get early detection on sexual abuse. I was at a conference not far north of here a couple of years ago. As I came off the stage, a female colleague of mine spoke after me. As she came off the stage, the next speaker slapped her on the bottom and said, "Well done, lass, I'll see you in the bar later tonight." This is 2 years ago. Quite depressing in the modern environment. So I thought, okay, we got the bastard. I mean, we all know what this guy is like. There's an informal agreement among male speakers that you never let him in a room on his own with a young female. Yeah, he's a notorious predator, right? So I said, we got him, right? So I went to the woman and said, formal complaint. She said, no way am I complaining. She said, if I complain, I'll be subject to secondary abuse when I'm forced to confront him. Then you'll get him banned because you're powerful enough to do that, and I know you'll get him banned, but then all his friends will gang up on me and my life will be hell. And I went to friends of mine in the big consultancies, 3 of them, all of them said the same thing. Nobody will report a misogyny or racism or fraud until it's so late that it's so serious, nobody got alternatives. So what we're now doing, this is experimental University of Sydney at the moment, but we're looking for more. If you're keeping your diary, which is part of your social setting within the university, if something like that happens to you or somebody in your group, you can tag it as a microaggression. If it's tagged as a microaggression in the software, all identity is stripped away from it. The story is stripped down to keywords, so it can't be tracked back. Then we look for patterns in the metadata on multiple reports so that we can trigger an alert to say you're now getting a range of small problems in this area investigated. So rather than the current system by which if people report something, everything has to be investigated, we're looking for early patterns. And that's been used for sexual assaults, for bullying, and for a variety of things. Actually, it turns out to be quite valuable for fraud and in factories for safety issues. Nobody likes to cry wolf. And nobody likes a whistleblower. Yeah, so we're building systems as an alternative to that. You start to see where I'm going with this, all right? Your research starts to become part of the substrate of the environment. As you build those sensor networks, you can ask them to go and interview people and find more questions. And the data is never lost. Yeah? So I've tried to give some indication on that. A couple of other things, because I want to address the transdisciplinary side of this. Other things we've been developing, that concept of a multi-role group. And by the way, the groups can't go to more than 7. It's quite interesting. We didn't evolve to make decisions as individuals. We're actually really bad individual decision makers. We evolved to make decisions in sexual pairs, work groups, which are also extended families, what are called demes, which are villages, and macro demes, which are combinations of villages. If you want the references on that, I can show it to you. And that's quite interesting. The macro, the demes are kind of like language, but the macro demes are genetic variety, conformity of identity. And we've lost a lot of that in modern society, because everybody is now a fragmented individual interacting with every other individual, and therefore you haven't got the inhibition. A friend of mine in the Mounties has a wonderful way of saying this. He said, it used to be every village had an idiot and it didn't matter, because everybody knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy, and we don't know. And that's pretty close to the truth if you think about it, right? So either way, to come back to this. So we know that in a group of under 7, 5 is a good number, people will compromise, because in an extended family, you have to learn to compromise. Once you go much bigger than that, people fall into their tribes, because they want peer review and peer reference. So working with those small groups works. Now, if you think about it, what we're doing with that is we're triggering the formation of an informal network across the organization between the silos. If you want a biological metaphor for this, it's the rhizomic fungal roots that connect tree roots. So the tree roots are like the formal system. If I cut it off up here, everything below dies. The mushroom roots connect all the tree roots, and fascinatingly, in a drought, they will redistribute resources to the saplings away from the mature trees. That's what informal networks do in organizations. If you want to find something, you need informal networks in another silo. You all know this. If somebody comes to you and say, you need to talk to that person, and you trust that person, you'll talk with the person. That's what's called trust tagging. It won't go beyond 3 degrees of separation. A lot of our work now in a university is to get everybody within 3 degrees of the manager or the vice chancellor. And you can do that in 2 years. Now, it's called the button threading problem in mathematics. The connections come together exponentially. Yeah? Now, what you're doing there is you're building an infrastructure through which ideas can flow very quickly, but that's also a key thing for innovation. Because what you want is to create the threading between departments that creates linkages so that people see novelty. And there's a process here called exaptation, which is kind of like where I really want to finish on this before I conclude. You may all know about this. So dinosaurs, if you don't know, all dinosaurs had feathers. If you've got kids with out-of-date books on dinosaurs, you've now got one up on them, right? We know this from discoveries in China. And the feathers were very colorful. So if you have lots of small colorful feathers, that's sexual display. That's what feathers evolved for, and maybe warmth. Then one dinosaur, I've forgotten the name, developed skin flaps over time under its limbs, so it can better display the feathers like a peacock. But that's a very small dinosaur. It has to run very quickly because it's more prey than predator. And one day, running very quickly, it starts to glide. And that's how we got flight. So a trait which evolves for one function, under conditions of stress, exapts, it doesn't adapt for something completely different. Now, that wouldn't happen in a linear way, because if dinosaurs threw themselves off cliffs in the hope of developing feathered wings before they landed, it wouldn't be a good strategy. The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved to do fine-grained manipulation of muscles in fingers. It exapts in humans to manage grammar in language. Grammar is far too sophisticated a function to develop in a linear way. It requires a non-linear repurposing. Yeah? Other examples, a Raytheon engineer in 1947, maintaining the magneto of a radar machine, noticed the significance of a chocolate bar melting in his pocket. He put a metal box around the magneto, the first microwave oven. Not so long ago in Merthyr Tydfil, which is one of the areas where I grew up in, they did an experiment on a cardiac jug with the local males. It produced a rather interesting side effect. We got Viagra. If you look at the history of human innovation, it's the history of repurposing something from one function to something else. IBM dominates computing in the 40s because it understands typewriters and punch card machines. It doesn't have to invent them from scratch. So managing for exaptation is really important. So to give you an example, this is something we've been doing with UCSD, and it's called an exactive incubator. So traditionally, incubators are places where you put companies, you give them money. A reverse incubator is they come to the university. An exactive incubator works like this. Everybody who's an academic basically puts what they're working on as a story or a text or a description into a narrative database. Remember the high abstraction metadata? Industry then identify their issues or problems, or society does. They get indexed into the same structure. Remember I said art and abstraction? We then put the two databases together and we find where problems coincide at an abstract level with solutions. And then we bring people together and say, do you know your idea seems to link with this problem? Why? That's called managing for serendipity. And that's actually very effective because it means you actually start to provide major increments to society rather than just incremental ones. And to give you an example, I gave this one earlier, but I'll repeat it. We were working with Philips Lighting Company, and they had the idea that if you made light a part of your garden, they get a whole new market. Yeah, rather than just using light to light the garden, you use it as a part of the garden. My annual purgatory is to go to the Chelsea Flower Show. I can't stand flower shows, yeah, but it's necessary to maintain my marriage, which is now at 45 years. So this is, I now go as an anthropologist and study the people because they're fascinating. So I've found a way around it. That's also how I handle American football. As an anthropologist, it's interesting. As a sport, it isn't, right? But you'll now see lights in the garden. So what we did there is we gathered 3,000 stories in pictorial or oral or written form about gardens that people liked or gardens they could imagine, indexed. We then got everybody in Philips to take all of their core technologies at any coherent level where they could pack it and ship it. That was the criteria. And they indexed it onto the same triad set. We then mashed the databases together. We got 5 significant correlation patterns. We presented those to marketing, and one of them produced a product which has made them a fortune, but which I'm ashamed of. It's a plastic rock that you put in a pond in your garden, and it changes lurid colors based on water flow, temperature, and proximity of any life. I mean, it's tasteless beyond belief. But as I say, it's selling well. It's entirely based on a technology originally designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in Eindhoven football stadium. Yeah? That's the sort of innovation we need to be thinking about as universities, is finding completely novel capability for things which we've been developing in other contexts. As I say, the history of society is based on that. And that also requires, kind of like final point I want to make, it also requires developing generalists. And universities don't do that anymore. Yeah, they develop deep specialists. And by the way, a T-shaped person is not a generalist. Yeah, they're a specialist who's picked up some knowledge in other areas. We argue in the UK at the moment there aren't any generalists left under the age of 60 because the educational system stopped throwing them out. Now, to give you an example, because I am one of them, all right? When I went to school at the age of 11, we were allowed to wear long trousers at 11, which was kind of like cute. If you've ever had to walk through a British winter in short trousers, it's not fun, all right? So we've now got long trousers, now the secondary school. And I had to walk to the front of the class on the Friday morning, and I got given a card and it said, "You support capital punishment." Now, my mother was leading the Labour Party campaign against capital punishment at the time. So this is the teacher being wicked, right? Everybody knows everybody in Wales, right? You can't avoid that, right? It's the culture. Yeah? And I had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation for something I profoundly disagreed with. We did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. And if you were good at it, you were formally taught rhetoric, and I carried on to do it competitively until my late 20s. Yeah? Now, that gave us several things. It gave you a huge amount of confidence. It meant you read everything because you didn't know what you were going to hit with next week. And it made you really critical, because arguing for things you don't believe in is one of the best ways of getting critical judgment. Yeah, it also made you very inventive. I still remember that first one because I was in trouble, right? This is the 70s. And I remember arguing we had to have capital punishment because come the revolution, the capitalists had to be put up against the wall and shot. They weren't expecting that one, but it twisted for the audience and it worked well. So you get quite clever at the way you play things. You get to think on your feet. The point I'm trying to make is that is a process which generates behavior. It's not an attempt to put the behavior on me. Nobody is teaching me to be critical. Nobody is teaching me to be a generalist. The process sets up an environment by which all of those things happen. Now, we've lost a lot of that in universities. Building processes which generate behavior is more sustainable than trying to change it directly. The journaling I've talked about, acting as ethnographers, we're now doing that to integrate in society. So we create a trio, a quin. One of the quins has to go into society and form a quin with people in society. So we link the two groups. Yeah, I've got in one South African university now, I think we're getting to the point where we'll have about 200 links without any major investment. Yeah, because as you link and connect people, you can find ways to do things. So think, and this is complexity theory. Complexity theory is also known as the science of uncertainty or entanglement. The origin of the word complicated in English is folded. That comes from Latin. If I can fold something, I can unfold it. It doesn't change. The Greek origin of the word complex is entangled. If I entangle something, I can't unentangle and tangle it again. So I always have path dependency. The more you entangle things, the more innovation you get. The more you try and order or structure things, the less innovation you get. And I want to leave you with a key phrase. I'll give you the academic version as well. The ordinary version is you want what is called messy coherence. If you get rid of the mess, nothing new happens, but you need coherence so you can see patterns in it. The fancier name for that is coherent heterogeneity. So let me illustrate that. I am South Welsh. I support Cardiff Rugby. Yeah, rugby is a religious matter where we come from. If we lose to the English, my grandfather used to wear a black tie and he wasn't joking. Yeah, losing to the English is the worst possible thing that can happen, right? I can tell you the reasons for that later if you want. So either way, Cardiff, if you don't know, we're the capital city. We play at the Cardiff Arms Park. We're very civilized as a crowd. If the other side do well, we congratulate them. We're not part of them. Our players always play by the laws. We never break the laws. You know, we're fair about this. You know, we're civilized.
So I'm not Italian, and I have a question about our university concept of studying based on your lecture. Maybe it will be useful to have correlation between subjects. Like if I study law, maybe I should study art and combine it, have some correlation in any field, because we can combine this basic information to create our inventions, yeah, and vice versa. Or it's not useful for us.
No, I think the answer is yes. It used to be called a joint honours. Yeah, so people would go to university and study joint honours. Yeah, they do one. We had a thing at Lancaster University where I went, which was called a free studies degree. So you could take 9 modules from any disciplines and put them together. Right? So you knew each model and then you did the integration. So I think universities should be encouraging, not all students, because if you want to be a deep specialist in physics, I was never going to be a theoretical physicist because I didn't devote my whole life to it. I was interested in it, but that's it. So you need a proportion of your students study in several disciplines. Yeah, that's important. Now, if you can't do that, that's where you start to bring the people together, right? But yeah, what you're talking about has been done. There's methods for it. It's just people have forgotten about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is not Natalia. I'm CEO of mid-sized company IT. here in Lviv, but we are working global. My question is not so important, although I will raise it. I just wanted to let you know that I started my journey as an Agile coach 10 years ago, and I was delivering a lot of classes here in Lviv IT school, and many of my lectures were starting from your picture.
Oh, you use Cynefin, yeah.
Yeah, using Cynefin exactly to explain where to use in what environments and systems. Agile is the mindset and approach, and of course, when I saw on Facebook by Natalia, another trainer, that you are in Lviv, for me it was kind of miracle because I was never thinking, expecting. Yeah, so that you know, you made huge impact on my life, and I used a lot of your knowledge and skills to share with people and yeah, make it popular. Of course, your braveness and courage visiting and supporting and empowering us at the special time is highly appreciated. My question was connected to AI, although I think you already mentioned, and I have an assumption where your answer would lead. There is a statement and hypothesis that for the nearest future, the knowledge itself will cost nothing and will mean nothing due to AI movement. So what would be your comment on this?
Okay, so several comments, all right? And first of all, thank you for the earlier comments, all right? And I really feel sorry for what's happening to Agile at the moment, but it was predictable, right? It became a certification business. So several things. First of all, AI, it should not be called intelligent. It isn't. It's an inference machine. It's artificial inference. It's not artificial intelligence. It's totally dependent on its training data sets. And part of the problem, and AI hasn't really changed in the last 30 years. I've been involved in AI for years. What's changed is the ability to capture data and process data. The algorithms are quite similar, and that's getting better. Now, the problem is you've also got the problem that AI is meant to solve the problems of global warming, but it's accelerating them. The energy consumption of AI is out of all proportion to any possible benefit. Yeah, quite seriously, every time you use one of those things, it's like flying a transatlantic flight. Yeah, the cooling of the server farms for this stuff is really scary, and it's taking away water from humans and everything else. So there are society implications for AI. Secondly, AI thinks inductively. Human beings evolved to think abductively. Yeah? If we don't actually use our abductive capability, we will lose it. I can smell snow coming, my children can't. Humans have capabilities which, if they don't get used, disappear. So the idea, and I said this once, if anybody thinks AI will exceed human beings in intelligence, their brain is probably ossified to the point where for them it might be possible. Right? You dumb yourself down to do it. Now, having said that, AI is a very powerful search engine. We use it to trigger anticipatory alerts on terrorism and for student bullying and things like that. But the main focus on AI shouldn't be the algorithms, it should be the training data sets. That's the most important thing. If you don't know what an algorithm has been trained on, you shouldn't be using it. Yeah. Also, AI, generative AI, is now feeding off its own output. If a model feeds off its own output, it's going to get corrupt even faster. Yeah, and that's what the bullshit, not hallucination point, right? So training data sets are key, right, in terms of the way you use it. And also, I'll make the very simple point. Elite American schools, the ones the tech bros send their children to, have banned technology from school. Because they know that if their kids develop human skills, they would have advantage over people who can be controlled by algorithms. Right? And I'm quite serious about that. You need to develop that capability. Right? So the ability to AI will always be better at us than producing a probabilistic summary of existing information. Yeah, but the trouble is it's a probabilistic summary. And I'll give you an example. I used it the other day to say, what is Dave Snowden's view on X? It had all my papers. It got it completely wrong. Yeah, like badly wrong. When I said, what will be the objections of an average sociology department to Dave Snowden's ideas, it got it completely right. Yeah, now that should tell you something. A, it's got more data, but B, it is reinforcing orthodoxy, not encouraging innovation thinking, because that's what probabilistic models do. So we need to realize that tools, I've been in IT all my life. IT gives you really powerful tools. But the point about a tool is if you pick it up, it should fit your hand. You shouldn't have to bio-re-engineer your hand to fit the tool. Right? And we're seeing AI as a sort of fetishistic device rather than a useful tool that we can use. In medical research, it's brilliant because I can control the training data sets. Once you get into human systems, you can't control the training data sets with any authenticity, and you get these massive cultural biases. In fact, if I'm going to be really rude, most of AI is generated by misogynist middle-aged males on the west coast of Australia who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which is grounds for commitment to a mental hospital, right? The cultural bias is really, really scary. Yeah, if you look at the data. I can give you some stuff on this. There's actually a website where you can go on. It says, you know, draw me pictures which are archetypal pictures of different roles. So terrorists are always Palestinians and doctors always have white faces. You'd be amazed what it does. And there's a wonderful paper everybody should read called Scholastic Parrots. It was written by a Google employee and published by an ex-Google employee. They fired her when they read the paper, because it revealed the truth about where the training data sets they were using came from. So sorry, I'm being cautionary on this. I want to emphasize this. I've been in technology all my life. I've used AI all my life. But people at the moment are hyping it the same way they hyped Agile, yeah, beyond its capability to deliver. Yeah. And I think there is, by the way, a sort of, you know, we run a humanities degree and nobody can use AI, and people write the exam papers in a hall with supervision might actually be a differentiator at some time in the future. Yeah, the ability to retain your knowledge for a whole field. I mean, you wouldn't allow a doctor to look up a textbook every time they have to make a diagnostic. Yeah, so that ability to reproduce something in reality across a broad, that's going to give students an advantage. Yeah, if AI can actually teach you, what you're being taught has little value. I'll say that again. If AI can teach you, what you're being taught has little value because the AI can do your job.
Good evening. Thank you, first of all, Mrs. Snowden, for the, I would use this cliche word, but insightful lecture. And thank you also for coming here to Ukraine. So I'm Andriana, and I majored in translation. So I would like to come back to the concept of transdisciplinarity, because as a translator, I now actually had problem with understanding the concept, right? But also another point is that quite recently, for known reasons, I've become more and more skeptical about things. So as for transdisciplinarity, I would like to ask about what the risks are, possible risks of this approach, right, to studying and also university teaching, and what are the limitations, whether there should be any, because, you know, having this uncertainty and then messy confusion, right, that's like one thing, and also another thing is having too many people and too many disciplines working on one challenge. Another thing is having few might cause lack of perspective, and another thing is that it can take a lot of time. So if you take a challenge-based approach, then the challenge might be over.
And translation is really this. So, for example, in Welsh and Irish, there are no possessive pronouns. I actually can't say I own a car. I can only say the car is with me. Right? We have a word called hirith, which the English translate as nostalgia, but it isn't. It's a desire to return to a place which probably never existed the way you remembered it, but you want to go back anyway. I mean, that's what it means, all right? And everybody in Wales can say, the danger is, I mean, we have a phrase in Wales, English is too good for the English. Yeah, they don't deserve it. And we think everything is too good for the English on broad principle, right? But the problem is AI and everything is homogenizing around American English and losing the diversity of language and different cultures. So that's the danger, you lose that diversity. When you move into transdisciplinary work, I think there are two things. You can only probably support 1 to 2% of your population as true generalists. Yeah, and generalists, I think, are born as much as made. Yeah, they're permanently curious. They can't focus. Interestingly, dyslexics make really good generalists. I haven't had time to go into neurodiversity, but we know that dyslexia is strongly linked with innovation and general capability. But if you try and train people not to be dyslexic to survive in a conventional environment, you lose that capability. So I think two things. One, it's a small number of people, but you need to find them and develop them because they're key. And you need to protect them, by the way, because they'll never fit in anyway. So they've got to be courageous as well. I think the second thing is you create processes which generate transdisciplinary work around projects. And I've given you some examples on that. So you recognize that you can have a process which brings together deep specialists, which can then produce similar results to a generalist. And those are some of the things I've worked on. Did I answer or not? What did I miss? You're looking at me like I missed something, so come on with it.
No, because as I mentioned, I've been skeptical, so I'm just more rethinking the critical mindset, and then, but it handed me to the answer, so thank you so much.
The other thing I'll say is that, I mean, I do a lot of work with translators. The worst thing I ever had was I had to give a speech in Beijing 2 years ago. And I followed a speaker from the Central Communist Party, which is truly appalling, right? You know what Central Communist Party presentations are like. They're pages and pages, right? But they were picking up my voice, translating it into English and translating it into Mandarin on the screen behind me with AI. So I've got no idea what it's actually saying. When you work with real translators, you spend an hour with them before you speak, going through the words and phrases, so they can translate it into the vernacular of the people concerned. And again, that's an argument for the role of people in communication. It's not just AI. Now, having said that, I use Google Translate all the time. It's a blessing, right? But I'm aware of the limitations. And if I ever worry about something, I find a native speaker and say, what do you think of that translation? I think we're done.